Hello my friends, Sakuya here, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 video. My friends, have you ever actually wondered what would have happened if the world had just worked with the Germans? A lot of bad things. A lot of bad things would probably still would have happened. Over the course of history, there have been many what-if scenarios. You know, what if a certain political leader had done something different? What if a different political party came into power instead of what won at one point in its history? Looking back at history, a lot of us may think that a bunch of this was set in stone, but reality is not so kind or friendly, especially when you're French. Yes, my friends, on today's episode, we're going to be doing one of the older paths, one that we haven't actually done for France. We have done monarchist France, we have done democratic France, but fascist France, one that actually works and collaborates with the Germans, is not one that we have done, and it presents a very interesting question. Many people are probably aware that back in the 1930s, there were a variety of different fascist movements that existed all around Europe. It's just only in certain places, such as Germany and Italy, that those actually took over, and then whatever the hell combination Spain actually ended up becoming. Germany wasn't necessarily always going to go fascist. The reason that they had done so, or one of the reasons, is that there was a large communist movement within the country, and there was constant fighting between nationalist forces and communist forces, and the regular people, more often than not, were siding with the nationalists over the destabilizing effect of the communists within cities. This was common all over Europe, to say the least, and so in France, what if instead of the communists rising up and taking more power for themselves, working with the democratic forces, what if it instead was the fascists? Well, let's see, my friends. Starting in the year 1936, France is not exactly in what we would call a good position. Though, then again, France has not exactly been in a good position for a lot longer than that now, haven't you there, buddy? Yep, not even your mustache can make you feel better. With terrible political instability, a horribly inefficient economy, which is not much different than what happens with France nowadays, to be fair, and a government that cannot seem to function, though I feel that, France, I do understand that pain. France is, to say the least, not in a good position. Not by a long shot. The thing to note about the country is that it has many different paths that you can actually take on the alternate history side. You have one of the more fun ones that you can do, which is going down and bringing back the monarchists, which is always fun and well and good. And of course you have all the varying different alternative, communist, and also democratic paths that you can follow, which are in and of themselves fascinating. But the one that people typically don't necessarily do is the fascist one, which on its own actually has two different things, either working with the Germans or working to kind of surround Germany in your own Latin bloc, which is also fascinating. The question becomes, if collaborationist forces had actually taken over things in France earlier, how easy of a time would the Germans have had? Well, let's find out. First thing that we're going to do is revive the national bloc. The political landscape is growing more radical by the day, and the left whispers of making common cause with the communists. What is needed now is strong, stable leadership. Make sure to get our industry underway, and then the first thing that we're going to need is, well, an actual usable industry here. Make sure that we get all the spots up here that actually have a decent number of slots. And military factor-wise, yeah, no one's really expecting things for French tanks. Though, ironically enough, for anyone who's not aware of this in history, the French, interestingly enough, had better tanks than the Germans did. A lot of people think that the Germans had the best tanks going into World War II. That was completely wrong. The French tanks were, pound for pound, superior, but German tactics were astronomically better and were utilized far more efficiently. With a very significant army, but one that is severely under-equipped and under-moraled, to say the least, we're going to need to consolidate and get all of that working in our favor. The greatest strength that one is to consider, though, is the French Navy. See, in actuality, in history, what had happened is that the French had scuttled their fleet eventually so that the Germans would not be able to utilize it. But if the Germans have access to the French Navy from the very beginning, that is in and of itself something that, combined with the Italian Navy, something that could fairly easily change the tide of history. Considering the volatile political landscape within the countryside, the French are really in no position to actually challenge the Germans, though this in and of itself would also be an interesting thing of what if the French had actually stood against the Germans from the beginning and had challenged them before war could break out. That's another interesting what if in history. In fact, I'm thinking I'm going to be starting this as a series of what ifs, and so I want you all to present in the comment section, if you can, a number of what ifs. What if something had happened? What if things were a little bit different? What if whatever? The top liked ones I'm going to take a look at here, and I'll probably put in community polls to see what it is that we can do, and we're going to answer this in both a in-game question and also kind of talk about the historical what ifs and ramifications of if that had actually happened. In this case, the only thing that we can afford is a diplomatic complaint. The next step immediately after that is to begin to utilize the leagues, because it is a sad fact that political violence has become commonplace in France. If the country is to survive the threat of communist revolution, we must not shy away from the help of people who can and will meet the communist thugs in the street if it comes to that. Here's the interesting thing when talking about rallying the leagues. The French fascist movement that arose within this is also something that arose out of communism in the first place. The founding members of the French fascist parties were actually communists that became disenfranchised with communism and adopted more nationalistic views. If anything, I would find it to be fascinating to see what would happen if the nationalists here, like the fascists, actually had something that would work hand in hand with the communists. Election communists in government. Yep, the communist movement in France, fueled by broad dissatisfaction among the working class and radical trends among academics, has grown large enough to lead the formation of several parties. Yes, this is one of the things that creates a large amount of instability within France, particularly by the time that the Germans actually go and invade. Unfortunately, at this point, the government is more keen on reform rather than revolution, so they would work hand in hand with the communists rather than standing against them. This, however, would be followed by different elements within the government going and working with the fascist elements to try and oust the communists, then turning around and removing them from the country if possible, removing their influence. Now, this is the interesting thing, because technically speaking, there are two possible options for what would happen with this historically. One, if they go and ban communism, then there is a chance that this is going to be something that stabilizes the country before World War II ever would actually break out, even in the circumstance of actually staying with a more democratic force. In removing more anti-government communist elements that are more likely to create internal issues, this means that the country may be more better prepared to actually tackle things externally. The other, and also in my opinion, more likely answer is that even though it's not represented in the game, in banning communism, considering how large of a force communism was within France, this simultaneously means that this rather large minority movement would go underground, creating further instability and issues within the country that's more than likely would be further fueled by the Soviet Union, creating even greater instability and the possibility of a future coup. But for now, within the game, ban it. The smartest thing to do, historically in this, for France, is to actually concentrate their industry. The reason that we're going to be doing this here is because it actually makes more sense for moving down a fascist side. See, historically, what happens with France is that their industry was naturally already quite dispersed. The issue was that the majority of French arms industry, especially aviation, was dispersed among many different smaller little companies that didn't work hand in hand with one another. This is one of the key reasons why French aviation was in such a terrible state, because there were so many different inconsistent minor companies that really had no way to produce enough planes with consistent, well, parts for things to actually meet war demand. We are, however, going to fix that. Now that communism is banned, that is going to present us with a couple options that we can do next year economically. The first is laissez-faire, and the second is agricultural protectionism. The interesting thing to note is that between the two of these, laissez-faire is by far better, much better, but since we are doing a alternative history build and not just something to try to rig the game, it doesn't really make sense for within a fascist country to go down a laissez-faire economic style. The government has to, after all, have more control over things within the economy, so we can't really do this, even though it's better. So to that end, if France had gone down more of the fascist path, you can be sure that they would have enacted some kind of protection on their own goods in order to be able to protect against Britain or outside foreign influence. Also, now that we have the option of rallying the leagues, that means we can first, A, rally the leagues, which is going to increase the popularity of fascism and not align, because we want to work against the communists, and also unleash le cagoule, which is I want you to imagine it's actually the French variant of the KKK, the thing that was specifically meant to go against the communist elements within the country. It was a terror group that was right-wing leaning there. Remove the stability of our country? Yeah, well, it's France, so that's kind of a natural and given. Even with the widespread instability across the country, which is pretty accurately represented here considering the crackdown against communist elements, what this means is that we are working hand in hand with these alternative groups in order to try and pressure the people within the country as much as possible. The unfortunate side effect, of course, is that the people in the country hate us, but that's something that we're going to have to deal with, and would have been very difficult for France to actually do historically. What's interesting to note is that considering the conflict that was going on in Ethiopia at the time, France would have been presented with an option, like many other nations, to embargo Italy. And at this point in its history, despite the fact that it may be leaning towards the fascist, it still needs the international community as it stands. So temporarily, what it would more than likely do is still continue to embargo Italy, not willing to try and risk the ire of the international community just yet. With agricultural protectionism enacted, that means that the next step after that would be to more than likely utilize la cagoule again. The reason being is that the more that they can crack down on the communists within the country, this means that France, though it does hurt its stability, would be able to rapidly move towards the fascist side and launch a movement of national regeneration. This, though we are doing rather fast, before 1937, is more than likely something that wouldn't have happened. That France would have needed significantly more time in order to be able to try and remove these elements from its society, meaning that you still more than likely would not have seen this until at least going into 1937, maybe even 1938. In our case, though, with a countrywide crackdown on communist and democratic elements, this means means that we are able to effectively coup the government and take things over. With the movement of national regeneration, this means that nationalist France is now fully in charge under the movement of Pierre Laval. Of course, the movement that we're going to be going towards now is towards a new Europe, which is going to put Jacques Doyon in charge, and this is the individual that I was talking about. Historically, he was actually a communist before he was ever a fascist, so the fact that he is the one who wants to take charge is rather interesting, considering the anti-communist leanings or how this focus tree has actually pushed itself. Though, what it shows with him being an eager collaborator is true. This was the party that was actually funded well by the Nazis going into history, specifically in order to try and create a fascist movement that would be able to govern things in France for the Germans. But before France can actually work with the Germans, that means that they need to first help with their own political unity. The history of France since the fall of absolutism has been a story of political infighting. When there was unity, France was victorious. When there was internal strife, France was defeated. All actually true. For this reason, we cannot allow the ambitions of the few to harm the livelihood of the many. Yes, indeed. With political unity, this means that at this point in its history, France would have actually unified and stabilized itself. The next course of action immediately after that would be to try and immediately get some sort of allies in order to be able to protect them while they work on their own internal development. Naturally, considering what it is that we are doing here, this means that Germany is the ideal partner. As such, historically, they would have likely gone with first trying to cancel their ties with those around them, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, the little entente, so to speak, and then from there, they would have aligned themselves more with the Germans. Of course, at this point, that means that nationalistic pride and propaganda is going to become absolutely necessary, so France would have likely invested heavily into trying to gear up their country in preparation for a possible war with outside powers. Also, at this point, securing their own internal stability and support among the people would have been paramount. Internal stability in this situation would have been absolutely key. At this point in our story, after everything that France has been doing, after changing itself over politically, and after all of its internal stability, it's at this point that more than likely Germany would have reached out, if they had not already been doing so earlier, in order to try and fund the movements of the fascist movement in the first place. After much trial and debate, it is at this point that the French government, under the leadership of Jacques Doyon, would actually go and try and align themselves with Germany. France, at this point, would be at a crossroads. We can shackle ourselves to the old order, or we can embrace the new. With the Germans poised to remake the continent, it would be beneficial for us to be on their good side. Indeed. In aligning with Germany, which at this point would have been one of the bigger economies on the continent, that in turn would have driven France out of its slump and actually allowed it to be able to increase its own trade, even in comparison to what it would have been doing with Britain, as it would have aligned itself politically with the fascist state. No longer would it have focused on civilian economy, no. By aligning with Germany, it in turn is going down a more militaristic path, and the Germans can see this. Of course, in aligning themselves with the Germans, the French are no longer at that point going to fear any possibility of any actions that Turkey may try and press against their own claims here in Syria. If anything, a movement to grow the French domain within the Middle East may actually grow within France, in turn causing them to turn their attention towards Turkey as another possible expansion route. Of course, much debate would follow with the Germans. For centuries, the people between France and Germany have lived in the belief that they were mortal hereditary enemies. This belief was founded in the idea that our interests were incompatible, but we could surely come to an agreement if we just defined our spheres of influence and studiously refrained from interfering. On that note, that is something that would give Germany its own idea of Lebensraum without ever actually having to turn its military towards the West, something that Germany would have hands down gone after because they never really wanted to immediately move west. Yes, they wanted revenge and to be able to crush France, but more importantly, they wanted to be able to expand their domain eastwards. That was always the plan. And so Germany, historically, what they wanted to do was to lead a coalition and alliance of other states against the Soviet Union. So what would have happened if France had actually offered to work with them? The German Reich would more likely, again, in the scenario, fully agree, fully allowing France into the Axis, which in turn would allow them to expand. The real question is, historically, what would have actually happened at this point? Would France have offered to split Belgium with the Germans, or would they have chosen to try and align Belgium specifically with them? Considering what France had already done historically in occupying parts of the Ruhr, which was what France tried to do in order to get back the reparations that it needed from Germany from World War I, it makes sense that rather than just politically aligning, they would go for something similar and try to actually directly occupy Belgium. So let's see what happens. The interesting thing to note about an alliance with Germany at this point is that this meant that France possibly would have been privy to what it was that the Germans were planning on doing with their future expansion. Italy, of course, was already cheating on the treaties, or had rather gotten rid of following the treaties by this point, which meant that France more than likely would have been asked by Germany to also focus on its navy, specifically in order to be able to stand against the United Kingdom. To that end, even though maybe we want to actually focus on building up our military factories, it makes more sense historically that they would have started building up their naval forces. And so that is precisely what we're going to do. Of course, we cannot guarantee how Belgium is going to react, but it seems very odd that what they would do is defy the French when at this point they would have been surrounded on two sides by the French and the Germans. Either way, I suppose it doesn't necessarily really matter. We can just go ahead and go declare war on them now, and that is something that is going to just destroy them. So to that end, the Belgians are just going to become a little speed bump for the French, who in turn, at this point, are going to focus on developing up their economy while trying to present everything for war production. After much harsh fighting with that, the fall of Brussels, this means that in turn, France would, once again, have its northern border secured. The big question is, would France go and actually take the territory of Belgium? Would they actually take over everything? Or would they go and create a puppet out of the states that remained? It is very possible that in the scenario, they would go and take the northern border, actually take over Belgium itself, while at the same time keeping everything else as a puppet. But for the sake of ease, let's just go ahead and assume that they would take over everything, consolidating Belgium into French control and also at the same time eager to use Belgian African resources in order to fuel French war industry. The big question now is, would France have taken the opportunity after Belgium to quickly strike against the British? The answer to that is more than likely no. Even though we could very well go and strike at the British right now and possibly take them out, France in 1938, especially after a fresh war with Belgium, would have been focused significantly more on internal stability and consolidation, and the Germans would have pushed France to not try and overextend themselves, to instead focus on their own development and specifically to build up their navy. And so that is what we are going to do. We're going to focus on naval rearmament. France would become the naval arm of the Axis, working hand in hand with Italy controlling the Mediterranean, while France controlling, hopefully from that, the Atlantic. On the note of what France would have focused on for naval rearmament, there is an idea that Germany may possibly pressure the French into focusing on different designs, but that doesn't really make much sense that France would change its ideas and thinking to the young school. It is possible that the leader, Jacques Doriot, that he would actually idolize Germany to such a degree that he would want France to emulate them, so one can make them argument. The other option, of course, is that the French Admiralty may focus more on the old school and what they were already doing, but really, who knows? For the sake of argument, considering that we're going to have the French work with the Germans and it makes sense to be sharing designs and plans, we're going to go with the young school. Developments in aviation, submarines, and torpedoes have made the capital ship obsolete. With our limited naval industry, we cannot afford to waste time and money on building gigantic floating fortresses that are helpless against the threats of the modern naval battlefield. We should instead focus on improving efficiency to allow us to build more small vessels. Indeed. Of course, this focus on a navy would have significantly burdened French industry. It is something that would have forced them to purchase large amounts of fuel in preparation for a common conflict that they know is going to come at the cost of current industry capabilities. Of course, with the Munich Conference, this means that Czechoslovakia's former ally of France would have long since abandoned it, not caring what actually happens with it. The choice is obvious. Leave the Czechs to their fate. Of course, by this point, there's no way that France is going to actually oblige by the treaties. It too is going to abandon the naval treaties, which in turn is going to allow it to produce significantly more and heavier ships. Of course, the French would have needed something that would have been capable of going toe-to-toe with British guns, meaning that they would have likely focused on a mixture between light and heavy cruisers rather than battleships. They couldn't necessarily abandon all of their focus on cruisers, or rather on their heavier weapons, because they still would need to fight the British, but they would have to produce more of lighter ships versus the bigger and heavier battleships that the British were famous for. Is it a good design? Maybe. I honestly don't know. I don't really know how to process many things with Navy here as of yet, but it is still something the French probably would have tried to create. Le baguette. Of course, without France to stand in anyone's way, this means that Czechoslovakia has now completely collapsed. Right on schedule, and of course Germany, with no threat to its immediate west, of course is going to be looking at future expansion that is going to be rapidly happening. At this point, no one is standing against them. There is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Italy joining with the German Reich as is natural. Italy, why do you want me to help with Ethiopia? Please, buddy. Calm the hell down. It's at this point, though, in June, that things are going to really take a hit, as Poland naturally by this time is going to be attacked. What I should probably mention here at this point is that considering that France has already aligned itself, that means that Germany might have actually gone after Poland or other forces earlier. There really is no reason for them to hold off until late 1939 to actually go after Poland or others, when they do not have to worry about anything that is going to be on their west. By this point, as Germany prepares to unleash hell, it would make sense that they would tell the French to prepare prepare their navy, as just in case the British decide to actually go and support the Poles, that the French would be prepared. They are being guaranteed after all, and even though it would kind of make sense, ahistorical, as if Britain would see that with Germany, Italy, and France all aligning themselves together, that the UK would be less inclined to intervene on the continent. Well, that's not exactly going to happen in the game. More likely, what would end up happening in that scenario is that the UK would actually back down, as they would have no ally on the continent to actually be able to fight. Poland, of course, would refuse the German ultimatum, even as France devalues the frog, and they move to develop themselves. The German Reich goes and declares war on Poland. This in turn means that Britain is drawn into the war, and the only thing that remains is what is going to happen with the French. After weeks of negotiation, the British, under, amazingly, Neville Chamberlain, actually do not back down. The unfortunate thing, though, is that France by this point is simply not ready to stand up to the British. It needs more time. It needs more time to outfit its navy in order to be able to invade the British Isles if the British refuse. Though the French navy is not going to be destroyed after being, occupied by the Germans, simultaneously they are not ready to actually take on the might of the British Empire. Of course, with Poland capitulating, this means that Germany will now go and focus attention on Denmark. The effort at this point, after launching their invasions and taking over as many naval ports as possible, is that after Germany takes over this territory, it means that the British Navy would more than likely have its forces and naval forces diverted in other regions, trying to keep up with the Germans as they expand. Denmark falls to Germany. Norway is slowly falling itself. The British at this time are more than likely occupied, with their forces spread out throughout here in the north. And by mid-February of 1940, the French Navy is fully prepared. With British forces spread throughout the region at this point, there is more than likely nothing that they're going to be able to do. And thus it is at this point in history that France likely would have launched its strike. Is it enough? The answer is just barely no. No, it is not. That is, of course, until the Italians decide to throw their navy into the lot, which in turn will allow them to finally launch their strike across the strait. With British forces largely spread out throughout the rest of the empire, this means that they are able to launch strikes onto the mainland itself. And before the British are even able to realize, the French will have already made it to London. After the initial forces sally forth across the island, this in turn would be followed by large-scale operations of moving the rest of the French forces across. The Germans themselves at this point are occupied with consolidating their own territory. And even though the French have taken heavy naval losses down here in the south, yes, that is going to happen. Simultaneously, the only thing that they needed to do was to get across the strait in the first place. Of course, with things the way that they were, the British would more than likely capitulate very quickly. There simply was no ability for them to actually resist against the Germans, the French, and the Italians all combined them in one go. Like that, the empire falls. The way that it would be divided, though, now that is the real question. More than likely, Western African territory would be granted to the French. This is really only natural considering their help, and they would be quite pleased with this. In addition, France would also likely request control of Luxembourg, being a natural territory that it would consider its own. Meanwhile, even though it would want the Netherlands, it would more than likely cave to the Germans in their desire to control it. England itself, though, now that is the big question. There's a couple options that historically would have happened in this scenario. More than likely, puppet governments would have been set up in multiple different locations, as the idea of governing the actual territory of the United Kingdom itself would have been simply too much. France more than likely would have cared much less about its old foe, though, and more than likely cared much more about the territory that it had formerly lost. That means Canada more than likely would fall under the sway of the French, who would in turn fuel Quebecois, the Quebecois. They would have harnessed a sense of French nationalism that possibly would exist within Quebec, and from there, utilize that in order to be able to exert power and control over Canada itself. With its remaining influence then going over consolidating its African holdings, while simultaneously rebuilding back its control of India that it once lost against the British. Of course, the lion's share of the reward would naturally go to Germany. This is something that it would guarantee to happen. So, the French would try to contest as much as they possibly can, taking over and consolidating as much of the possible territory as they could, but of course, they're not going to get all of it. Just not realizing this, for whatever reason, that the Germans are not taking this part of Norway. I don't know why they wouldn't do that here. I mean, if they're not going to do this, then that means I'm going to be able to puppet the remainder of this territory, which I'll take here, but, yeah, moving on from a little bit of history, the Sampi people are free. And that, with my friends, peace in Europe. By April of 1940, it is that fast. The one thing that I forgot to do that historically probably would have happened is that the French would have seized the entirety of the British. I can't believe I forgot to seize the British Navy. God damn it. Of course, the thing was that France historically by this point already was suffering from problems of already having full employment. This in turn means that after occupying all this territory and even more men being drafted into the army, that France, rather than having economic benefits from it, would more likely have had even further troubles they would have experienced. Even with its own nationalist pride, this still means that things would likely not be fixed until it allowed for additional citizenship in order to be able to get more people in, even though the nationalists would have not liked this. It is something that probably would have been forced out of necessity. The big thing, from what I've seen, is that actually the French Navy did hold up remarkably well against British forces, destroying 21 different destroyers. Phenomenally well done, actually. How did our Navy actually end up doing? We kept 164 vessels. Not bad. Not bad at all, actually. Sure, this is also something that does make sense historically what probably would have happened. In the event that Germany was totally victorious over the British, over everyone, it makes sense that rather than holding off, as you know, the plan was always to go against the Soviet Union, that they would have instead attacked the Soviet Union earlier. The only reason that they didn't do so in the first place is because they needed time to prepare. And it was only after believing that the Allies would not be able to take them on that they did try to strike the Soviet Union, taking them out as fast as they could, but obviously we know how that turned out. In a world in which France actually sides with them and enables a very quick victory over Britain, this means that Germany, even though it may not be as prepared, simultaneously has significantly more forces that are prepared and freed up to be able to do battle on the front line. The French, of course, would also be willing to help, especially if offered concessions in oil, something that they would lack. The Soviets, in the event that they are attacked in 1940, this means that they are still actually fighting against Finland, something that would only further weaken them as the majority of their forces were already diverted north. A quick victory of the Axis over the Allies in turn means that the Soviets are not only just on their back foot, they're backed into a corner. No reforms seem to have taken place within the Union, in turn leading to mass casualties on the battlefield, as no one is capable of doing anything to stand against the Germans. The French, of course, are going to naturally move in to assist their allies, and the overwhelming forces of the Germans, as well as the French and the Italians, means that even with everything considered, the Germans would by this point outnumber the Soviets. Truly a shocking development. Within a matter of weeks, as most forces would already be diverted north in order to be able to fight against the Finns, this means that within the south, a combined German, Romanian, Italian, and French operation would steam through any resistance. Of course, the Italians by this point, as they did historically, would take the opportunity to try to expand their interest in Greece, who would have to in turn align themselves with the communists. This, unfortunately, would divert Italian attention away from other parts of the battlefield and would focus them solely on the south, where Greece would actually hold them off, just as they are here, for many, many months, delaying further Axis aggression into the Soviet Union. Of course, even considering its factory problems, there simply is no way that the nationalists would allow immigration from other parts of the empire to change the makeup of France. More than likely, what they would do is focus on making France itself indivisible of one single identity, while still, at the same time, pushing the colonial enterprises to the fringe. Within a matter of, really, only about 4 or 5 months, Moscow itself would fall, slower at a rate than, Mustache Man had anticipated, but historically that's going to happen no matter what, as the Soviet Union was simply far more vast than any of the Germans had ever anticipated. Hundreds of thousands of men would die. There are no smart tactics. There is no impressive blitzkrieg that is developed. Instead, the Germans actually wouldn't have nearly as much combat experience as they had in our actual timeline because they didn't have to fight nearly as many people. They didn't have to quickly learn how to encircle things with fighting against the French. Instead, no. Everything for them has been a cakewalk. The Soviet Union, despite the lesser number of forces, may have been an actual fight in comparison, leading to hundreds of thousands of men dying in blind charges across the battlefield. Of course, they still did have blitzkrieg tactics, but they wouldn't have been fine-tuned in comparison to what they previously were. Even after the fall of Moscow, the Soviet Union would not give up. For them, at this point, it was a death war. The only hope that the Germans would have of a quick war against the Soviet Union, just as it would historically, is in the event of so much carnage taking place that the internal systems collapse. This wouldn't actually allow the Soviet Union to sue for peace. No, the Germans would never accept that, trying to wipe out each and every one of them to the last man, woman, and child. But it is something that would allow them to effectively divide and conquer within the Soviet Union as varying different peoples rose up and tried to unify against the Soviet Union, tried to sue for peace. And then, whether it takes 6 months or 6 years, eventually, the Soviet Union has to fall. Okay, no, I'm breaking character when I'm saying this here for a moment, but way more war score should have been generated in this circumstance. What the hell? Considering that the control that France has at this point within India and Indochina, the only thing that I can think that they would reasonably want off of the Soviet Union here is control of the Baku oil fields, and maybe Siberia, maybe having a naval base over here. But in this case, no, they likely would seize a source of oil. Even with the Germans saying no, the French would have levied all of their assistance in taking out the UK as a means by which the Germans would have to give them something, especially since the Germans already would have seized all oil that would have belonged in Indonesia and other territories. Besides that, though, the Soviet Union would be wiped. Just like that. By July of 1941, the German Reich reigned supreme over the entirety of Europe. No one is capable of standing against them. Not the United States, not Japan, not China, not anyone. Considering that we're playing in Hearts of Iron 4, what would have happened in this circumstance is that Japan, of course, is going to attack because the German Reich owns all of this territory within Indonesia, but in this alternate history scenario, that is not what would have happened. Japan would have happily continued to trade with the Germans, able to get all the steel, all of the tungsten, all of the oil, all of anything that they possibly wanted off the Germans, because they would have not had any qualms with trading with them in comparison to what we had previously seen with the United States issuing a trade embargo against Japan. So no, in this alternate history scenario, they have no reason to attack. Germany also, at this point, has no reason to go after the United States. The United States, they themselves would likely enter a period of isolation and also economic downgrade, considering that all of their biggest trading partners that they would have had in Europe are gone. Though, to be fair, they didn't really open themselves up at this point until going into the start of World War II. With Britain getting wiped out, France actually being an ally of Germany, and the Soviet Union not getting an option for Lend-Lease because they were attacked and taken out so quickly, this in turn means that American aid never actually fixes the Great Depression. That doesn't happen. The United States instead falls into their current state of isolation and squalor. Slowly making it out, but never in a position to actually resist the might of Europe. My friends, this has been Stakui with a Hearts of Iron 4 alternate history playthrough. I kind of like this. It was something that was both storytelling from this and also a hypothetical what if. I don't even know how to phrase it. It was something that I found to be very interesting. And if there are other what if scenarios, something that you would like me to talk through the history of what did happen and what would happen if something was different or if something went a certain way, then by all means, let me know in the comment section below. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and my friends, I will see you all next time. Goodbye, guys, and thanks for watching.